Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Chobe. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Chobe.
Okay, hello there. This is the fourth in a series on Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future. This topic today is going to be the discussion of the ancient thoughts on liberty. And this might be a little slow going. And when I was researching this, I had to dig through a lot of material and try to condense it down to the bare essence of how it relates to what we're talking about here. Part of the problems with looking back in ancient history is trying to come up with an accurate date of when things occurred. Prior to the landing on the moon by Neil Armstrong, most of the dates that were basically calculated, some on carbon dating and things like that, or some kind of marker somewhere. But when Neil Armstrong placed a reflecting mirror on the surface of the moon in 1969, scientists were able to shoot a laser at that, and from that be able to go and calculate retro into the ages based upon just the phases of the moon. Now, mind you, the moon is an interesting body. It's about 1/400th the size of the sun, and it's about 400 times away from the sun as it is to the earth. Now, what does that mean? Well, and it also rotates at the same speed that the earth does. So when you look at the moon, the same side is always facing us. So if a laser was placed in there in 1969, then scientists can lock onto that and use that to accurately determine the length of a year. Now, if we go back in history again, we look at there's some documentations of things such as an eclipse of the sun occurring at a certain time, mostly dated by the individuals in power. But from that, again, you can calculate a lot of events that happened, the dates that they happened years ago, at a much greater level of accuracy than anything prior to that moonshot. So let's take that then. Now, when we talk about liberty, it's one thing to have a sense of freedom within the confines of a certain set of laws or a certain set of customs, morals, whatever have you. But in order to carry that on beyond the term of the leaders or the king, it is important that there be some way to document that's easily understood and therefore repeated over and over again. And you really can't have any kind of communication that's documented to any sense of accuracy unless you have some type of an alphabet. So when we go back and look at the alphabet, prior to that time, there were Egyptian hieroglyphics, and there were pictographs at different places there in cuneiform characters, meaning rudimentary kind of senses, in a sense that a number of little pictures would lead to some kind of conclusion. But the script was actually a series of wedges of sorts, and it was pretty much an early form of the communication, but it was only understood by the people who were educated enough to read it. And with those little markers and stuff, and the power of knowledge and the power of education meant essentially that ability to have a written shaped characters into a sentence was pretty much confined to the leadership, the elite, the gentry. So the earliest forms of alphabetic characters and the word or the letter alpha essentially evolved from the face or the shape of an oxen. You can see that the bottom parts are two legs of an alphabet. If you turned it sideways, it would look like the horns of an oxen. But that was sort of the beginning of making one letter. And as this happened at a time around 1670 BC, when during the reign of Joseph. Now, remember, Joseph He was one of the sons of Israel who was sold into slavery by his brothers over jealousy and over a coat of colors, many colors, that is. And he eventually became, through various trials, he eventually became the prime minister of Egypt. He was the second most powerful man in Egypt at the time. And one of his legacies was that because he had saved Egypt from starvation and through floods and things, he built a great big reservoir for the waters of the Nile to flow into it. So when the drought came, there would be water for them to use. I believe that that lake is called the Lake of Joseph, even to this day. But he was given great favor by Pharaoh, and with that, he put his people, and they populated up near the Nile, or the delta of the Nile, and they became very numerous. And part of his plan was to educate them as well. So one of the ways that they were able to pass on ideas was through the development of alphabetic characters. Now, as time went on, of course, we know the familiar story about how the Hebrews became so numerous in number that they became frightful to the Pharaoh, who then started putting them into various forms of slavery in order to control them, including at one time trying to kill all the babies under 2 years old, which we know Moses escaped that incident when was raised by the daughter of the Pharaoh, and he rose up to become a great warrior and leader. As the story goes, of course, then he struck and killed an Egyptian, and out of his shame and fear of losing his status, he fled into the desert, the Sinai area, for many years. Now, the reason I use the Old Testament story of Joseph on this, and I'm sure that there's some people out there will say that, well, there's these other cultures and civilizations all over the world who did similar sorts of things. The reason I use this example is because Western civilization is built upon the foundation literally set by the Hebrews and Moses, long before any other civilization evolved. Now there's frequently you hear some civilization was dug up somewhere, whether it be the Mayas in South America or some in the China area of China mainland. But here's the big difference: is that they didn't survive. And what we have today as the Western world and the framework of that original group of people is proof enough to the authenticity of whatever they had. So here we have Moses, and he's out there wandering around, and of course he sees the burning bush, and then he gets this idea that he has to go back into Egypt and gather up the Hebrews and bring them out of there. And thus he does, and through many miracles that they claim. They ended up near Mount Sinai, where the mountain was full of smoke and fire at the top of the hill. It made tremendous noise, and Moses was told by God that these are his laws, and he wrote out the 10 Commandments with the finger of God. Moses, of course, took those and went down to the village or went down to the settlement, the encampment, of course, and we know the rest of the story. But here it was. We have this alphabet that was rudimentarily made by Joseph and was used through the Hebrews to sort of somewhat educate themselves. So they weren't stupid people. They were rather advanced in terms of their ability to pass on knowledge to one generation to the next. And along comes these sentences using these rudimentary figures. And the 10 Commandments, as we know them today, basically turned out to be the first form of written laws, and in essence, the rule of law. And the rule of law is important throughout history because it's what gives us our legal structures today in America. So I wanted to point some of that out to you because without understanding about how we communicate to one another beyond generations and understanding about the alphabet itself, we really have to take a guess at how our society and how many countries and kingdoms and such were developed out of that 10 Commandments into what we call Western civilization. The Hebrew alphabet was 22 characters, the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the end. And the Greek was 24 characters, the Alpha and the Omega. And the English language, as we know it today, has 26 characters. So you can imagine there's going to be some confusion about how different things are stated, simply because there's 2 less letters in the Greek to the Hebrew and 4 from the English to the Hebrew. But the term alphabet actually came from the Alph and the Taw. So that becomes important to understand later on. Now, over time, of course, as other civilizations, particularly the Greeks, figured out that this was something that was worth having, with an alphabet and with stories and words to tell, it developed over time, and it created an opportunity for abstract logic in science and literature, philosophy, law, history, etc., politics. And so people began to think out loud, or to debate different thoughts and ideas. And so when we look at what came out of that written set of laws, then we had the use of ideas that were pretty much came forth through the Greeks. Now, the Code of Cambrai, there's another, well, this is another sort of 10 commandments. Excuse me for backing up a little bit, but the Code of Cambrai is recognized as one of the oldest sets of laws for a city-state, not a people, just a city-state. And it goes on to say various things about what's right or wrong. Essentially, they're making some kind of argument that a higher power is what really is what keeps everything together. They're being fearing God and ruling about the rule of righteousness or so, and destroying wicked and evildoers as such. But it is out there as well. You'll see that. And as I said, it's trying to date these things in terms of who's going to be first or whatever. Goes back to the ability for scientists to use the moon recordings of the eclipse, and then tying it to the cycles of the moon to come to those times of calculation. So on we go from that now to the Greek, and it's about the 5th century BC, and where the idea is that they've had kings and such before that. Of course, there's always the strong men, the tribal head, whatever have you. And this is, in this case, this is where the saying might is right. If you have a tribe of people and you have one strong man and he decides that it's wrong to do something, or if you do it, you get bonked on the head, then that strength is right. And people better listen to him and not do it, or they'll get bonked on the head. So from that, as time went on, there were some different thoughts about how to organize the sovereignty of a country. And they decided that, well, let's have everybody have a say in it. So they ended up with this little sort of rudimentary democracy. And the idea was they were going to create a society. They're going to create the rules that they live by. And supposedly, based upon common sense at the time, whatever that may have been, or the cultural norms, what have you. So from these discussions, there are really 2 major people that contributed to this. And Plato was one of them, and Socrates was the other. And they really had different views about things. Plato and Aristotle, excuse me. Plato had a book, The Republic. He called it The Republic. And it was basically, he described an ideal political community. And he says that the political power must be, the might, if you will, must be supreme in order to maintain social order. So here he had the sovereignty of a government, and this idea of a sovereign government and political power is just recognizable in Western societies even today. But he stressed the political authority as the chief protector of the community, a source of power to be used to protect people from a sometimes hostile world. Of course, the ideal government would be based upon unchanging moral foundations of truth, justice, and goodness, and this can only be achieved by carefully structured reason, as opposed to the heavy-handed brute force, which is the might versus right kind of thing. So this had some following to it, and it made some sense, because prior to this, there really wasn't much sense to be made about how these things were done. But he may emphasize that social harmony and national strength as that required personal consciences and laws that reflected just values. And he talked about the individual's ability or responsibility for self-control in order to have the social harmony that was needed to run a society. So in various writings and such, the sum of it is that only you can provide unity through the spirit of moral justice. So this can only be obtained through force, the might versus right kind of thing. And so after all this had been going on, I mean, eventually Plato's form of government would demand an absolute communism. So the needs of the community would take precedence over the rights of the individuals. And so we see that even today. Keep that in the back of your mind. He believed that only community guaranteed physical protection from enemies would allow individual liberties to exist. So people would be protected, but they'd be in bondage as well. So then along comes Aristotle and his books, Politics. He described a political community that took a more down-to-earth kind of appearance. He attempted to describe the community that people would most naturally want under the most likely of circumstances. So here people would find the opportunity to realize a liberty based upon their personal goals and within the world of political powers. This form of government would provide the means to protect the different customs and traditions of the people instead of standardizing into like a form of communism they'd be forced to follow. The preservation of the differences between people was to protect the individual and family from the control of the government. In this sense, Aristotle's viewpoints were similar to those of our own Thomas Jefferson. So remember here, you have Plato's Republic, which is communism, and then here you have Aristotle's Politics, which is more like T.J. Jefferson. So these two ideas were bandied around for many, many years, and essentially, but the idea is sort of stuck. What is going to be the center of the sovereignty of in the ideal form and something to strive for? How is it going to relate? Strong government, strong hand of government, might versus right, versus with Aristotle saying right versus might. Right is might. So some of this sort of kicked back and forth, and then eventually we got around to 450 BC and the 12 tablets of stone that came into being under the Russian law. It declared some form of standards of right and wrong behavior, sort of not unlike the Ten Commandments. It probably was designed to sort of contradict or to compete with it. But the emperor himself still had the final word on any of the matters. So, but much of the public law itself was unwritten, and customs and things and parliamentary rules became a model, though, for later Western civilization. And the structures of our republic itself are not accidental from standpoint of liberty. The Romans were barbaric and depending on enslavement of enemies and commoners to sustain the empire. While it appeared that Pax Romani, or the Peace of Rome, was an indication of its legitimate political structure, the Roman government eventually collapsed under the weight of debt and political overreach and moral degradation of the family, etc. So when right becomes wrong, people suffer from chaos. So let's leave it there. Those two ideas, those of Plato and Aristotle. Remember what they're thinking is like, on one hand, Plato's talking communism, and then on the other hand, Aristotle's talking American freedom like Thomas Jefferson did. And we'll get back and revisit this next time, and we'll talk about some of the changes that came on in the Middle Ages. And hopefully I will be able to continue to enlighten you as to what liberty in America truly is about. Remember that might, when it's right, people are in bondage. When right is might, people are free. When right becomes wrong, people live in chaos until might or right becomes supreme. In which case, if we take the road of right, we're free. If we take the road of might, we become enslaved, probably more so than before. Okay, signing off. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good one.